A poor waitress, called the Vampire King, his son was found. Collapsed on the street. Don't look at the shadows too long, child, or they might blink back. The warning hung in the freezing air, fragile as a snowflake. Liliana pulled her thin coat tighter, the wool scratching against her raw, red neck. The street lamp flickered overhead, a dying amber eye watching the alleyway where the boy lay, curled like a discarded ribbon. He wasn't moving. The snow was already claiming him, dusting his pale lashes with white. "Hey," she whispered, her voice trembling not from the cold, but from a sudden, primal recognition of tragedy. "Stay with me." The winter in the Low District did not just chill the skin, it ate at the bones. It was a hungry, living thing that prowled the cobblestone streets of Oakhaven, seeking out the cracks in window frames and the holes in boots. Liliana Ashford wiped the counter of the Rusty Spoon for the 100th time that night. The laminate was peeling at the corners, revealing the particle board beneath, much like the city itself, gilded in the high towers of the shifter nobility, but rotting down here where the humans lived. The diner smelled of stale grease, old coffee, and the damp wool of the few patrons huddling for warmth over empty mugs. "Closing time, Lily." The owner, Mr. Higgins, grunted from the kitchen. The clash of pots being thrown into the sink punctuated his words. "Unless you want to pay for the heating yourself." "Just 5 more minutes, Mr. Higgins. Old man Abernathy hasn't finished his toast." Liliana smiled at the elderly man in the corner, though the expression didn't quite reach her tired hazel eyes. She was 24, but tonight she felt 80. Her back ached from a double shift, and her tips barely amounted to enough for rent, let alone the heating bill waiting on her kitchen table. When she finally pushed out the heavy oak door into the night, the silence of the city was deafening. The snow was falling in thick, heavy clumps, muffling the distant sounds of the noble district's carriages and engines. She walked quickly, head down against the wind. It was then she saw the bundle. It looked like a pile of rags dropped near the overflowing dumpster of the bakery next door. But rags didn't shiver. Liliana paused, her breath hitching in her throat. The instinct to keep walking warred with the ache in her chest. Getting involved in anything in this district was dangerous. But then a small whimper cut through the wind, a sound so broken it shattered her hesitation. She knelt in the slush. The boy couldn't have been more than 7. He was dressed in clothes that were finely made, but ruined. Velvet torn by briars, silk stained with mud. His skin was the color of skimmed milk, and his lips were a terrifying shade of blue. "Can you hear me?" she asked, brushing wet hair from his forehead. He was burning up, ice on the outside, fire on the inside. He didn't answer, but his hand shot out, gripping her wrist with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for a freezing child. His eyes flew open. They were violet, shockingly bright, swirling with a strange, luminescent depth. "Hide," he rasped, the word tearing out of his throat. "The shadows, they have teeth." "I've got you," Liliana murmured, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't know who he was, but she knew he didn't belong here. The fabric of his coat whispered of money, of the high district. She scooped him up. He was lighter than he looked, frail as a bird. She looked left, then right. The street was empty, save for the swirling snow. "I'm taking you home," she whispered into his hair, which smelled faintly of pine and ozone, the scent of a storm before it breaks. She ran. She ran past the shuttered shops and the darkened alleyways, carrying the weight of the strange boy and a growing, gnawing dread that she had just picked up something far heavier than a child. She had picked up fate. Liliana's apartment was a single room above a cobbler's shop. It was drafty and small, filled with books she'd salvaged from the trash and furniture she'd mended herself. But it was hers. She kicked the door shut and laid the boy, Cassian, on her narrow bed. She stripped off his soaked velvet coat and wrapped him in her thickest quilt. Then another. Then her own coat. "Please," she whispered, rushing to the tiny kitchenette to boil water. "Please don't die on me." The kettle began to whistle, a shrill sound in the quiet room. She made tea with the last of her honey and herbs, a recipe her grandmother had taught her for fevers. When she returned to the bed, the boy was thrashing. "No." "Father," he moaned. His voice was changing, deepening into a growl that vibrated in his small chest. Liliana froze. She watched as the boy's fingernails seemed to lengthen, sharpening into points before retracting. Shifter. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She stepped back, the mug shaking in her hands. Humans and shifters existed in a tentative truce, but the laws were clear. Separation. For a human to harbor a shifter child, especially one who looked high-born, was not just illegal. It was a death sentence. If the authorities found him here, they wouldn't ask questions. They would assume she had kidnapped him. "I should call the enforcers," she whispered to the empty room. But when she looked down at him, the fear evaporated. He wasn't a monster. He was a child who was trembling, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold room. She sat on the edge of the bed and lifted his head, bringing the mug to his lips. "Drink, it's warm." He swallowed instinctively. The honey seemed to soothe him. His breathing evened out, the growl fading back into a soft, human snore. Liliana didn't sleep. She pulled a chair to the window and watched the street below. The snow had turned into a blizzard, a white curtain erasing the world. Hours passed. The clock on the wall ticked rhythmically, mocking her anxiety. Then, the feeling hit her. It wasn't a sound. It was a pressure in the air, a static charge that made the hair on her arms stand up. The birds that usually nested in the eaves outside fell silent. The wind seemed to hold its breath. A low rumble vibrated through the floorboards. A car engine? No. It was too deep, too organic. Liliana stood up, her heart leaping into her throat. She moved to the window and peered through the frost. Down on the street, a shadow had detached itself from the darkness. It was massive, a silhouette of broad shoulders and a long coat whipping in the wind. The figure wasn't walking. He was prowling. He stopped directly in front of the cobbler's shop. Even from 3 stories up, Liliana felt the weight of his gaze. He looked up. 2 burning gold eyes met hers through the glass. They weren't human eyes. They were the eyes of a predator who had found its prey. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. She backed away from the window, looking at the sleeping boy. "Who are you?" she whispered. The front door of the building downstairs didn't open. It exploded inward. The sound of wood shattering echoed up the stairwell, followed by heavy, thundering bootsteps, taking the stairs 2 at a time. He was coming. Liliana had no weapon. She had a dull butter knife and a heavy cast-iron skillet. She grabbed the skillet, standing between the door and the bed where the boy slept. It was a ridiculous defense, pitiful against a shifter, but it was all she had. The footsteps stopped outside her door. There was no knock. The lock cylinder simply snapped with a metallic ping, and the door swung open. The man who filled the frame was terrifying. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with hair the color of midnight and a jawline that looked carved from granite. He wore a tailored suit beneath a heavy coat lined with fur, but the civilized clothing did nothing to hide the savage violence radiating off him. Evander Greymore. Liliana didn't know his face, but she knew the aura. The sheer power rolling off him was enough to make her knees buckle. This was an alpha. The alpha. His golden eyes swept the room, dismissive of the poverty, dismissive of her, until they landed on the bed. Cassian. The name was a ragged exhale, part prayer, part growl. He took a step forward. "Stay back!" Liliana swung the skillet up, her hands shaking so hard the iron rattled. Evander stopped, and he looked at her then, really looked at her, for the first time. His expression was one of absolute incredulity. A human female, smelling of cheap soap and fear, brandishing a frying pan at the king of the Greymore pack. "You have 3 seconds," Evander said, his voice a low baritone that vibrated in Liliana's chest, "to explain why you have my son before I tear this building down around your ears." "I found him," Liliana stammered, but she didn't lower the pan. "He was freezing in the alley behind the bakery. I brought him in to warm him up." Evander's nostrils flared. He was scenting the air, testing her lie. He smelled the sickness on the boy, the honey tea, and beneath it all, the clean, terrifyingly honest scent of Liliana's intentions. There was no scent of deception. "He's sick," Liliana added, her voice gaining a fraction of strength. "He was burning up. His nails changed. I know what he is. But I didn't hurt him." Evander moved. He was a blur of motion, too fast for her eyes to track. In a heartbeat, the skillet was wrenched from her hand and tossed onto the sofa, and he was standing over the bed. He ripped the quilt back, checking the boy's limbs. When he saw the blue tint of Cassian's lips, the alpha's composure cracked. A look of pure, devastating anguish crossed his face before the mask of the king slammed back into place. "Cordelia," he snarled, a name that sounded like a curse. "She poisoned him." He scooped the boy up into his arms, the quilt trailing on the floor. "We are leaving. You can't take him out there." Liliana stepped in front of him. It was suicide. It was madness. But she did it anyway. "Look at him. The shock of the cold will kill him. His heart rate is barely stable. If you take him back into that blizzard, he won't make it to your car." Evander loomed over her. The gold in his eyes swirled with irritation. "Move, woman. I have healers at the estate." "The estate is 20 miles away," Liliana argued, finding courage in her desperation to save the child. "The roads are iced over. I heard the plows stopped running an hour ago. He needs heat, and he needs to stay still." Evander looked down at the boy in his arms. Cassian whimpered, burying his face in Evander's coat. "Cold," the boy muttered. The king froze. He looked at the frosted window, then at the shivering child, and finally at the defiant woman blocking his path. He could snap her neck with a flick of his wrist. He could move her aside like a curtain. But the boy was fragile, breakable, and the storm outside was howling like a banshee. Evander Greymore, the Wolf King who commanded armies and bowed to no one, let out a frustrated roar that shook the window panes. He turned around and gently laid the boy back onto Liliana's bed. "If he dies," Evander said, turning to face her, the gold in his eyes hardening into molten coins, "there is no place on this earth you will be able to hide from me." Liliana swallowed hard, her throat dry. "He won't die. Not if I can help it." "Then help him," Evander commanded, tearing off his heavy fur-lined coat and throwing it over the boy. He loosened his tie, looking around the tiny, cramped apartment with the air of a caged tiger. "We are trapped here until the storm breaks." He looked at her, his gaze intense and uncomfortably intimate in the small space. "What is your name?" "Liliana," she whispered. "Well, Liliana," Evander said, walking to the door and shoving the broken lock back into place with a jammed chair. "Pray that the snow stops, for both our sakes. Outside, the wind screamed, burying the city in white, sealing the king, the waitress, and the dying prince inside a room too small for their secrets. The apartment was a box of shadows and drafty corners, but Evander Greymore filled it completely. He didn't just occupy the space, he dominated it. He paced the 3 feet between the frosted window and the kitchenette, a caged panther in a bespoke suit. Every turn was sharp, efficient, and radiated a leashed violence that made the very air feel heavy. Liliana sat on the floor near the bed, her knees pulled to her chest. She was shivering, though she tried to hide it by digging her chin into her knees. She had given every blanket she owned, the thin quilt, the scratchy wool throw, even her own winter coat, to the boy. The heating unit in the corner had given up the ghost an hour ago, rattling a death rattle before dying into an icy silence that let the wind outside scream louder. "You are cold," Evander said. He didn't turn around, gazing out at the whiteout blizzard, yet he knew. "I'm fine," Liliana lied, her teeth threatening to chatter. "It's just a draft. Old buildings breathe." Evander stopped pacing. He turned his head slowly, looking at her with an expression that was hard to read, part curiosity, part irritation at her biological fragility. He moved away from the window, the floorboards groaning under his weight, and sat on the edge of the mattress near Cassian's feet. The proximity of him was overwhelming. He radiated heat like a wood stove, a dry, fierce warmth that rolled off his skin in waves. It was a supernatural furnace, burning brighter than any human fever. Liliana instinctively leaned toward it before catching herself, her cheeks flushing. "Why?" he asked, his voice low enough not to wake the boy, but heavy with demand. It wasn't a question. It was an interrogation. Liliana blinked, tired hazel eyes meeting his burning gold ones. "Why what? Why bring him here? You know what I am. You know what he is." He gestured around the room, taking in the peeling wallpaper, the stack of salvaged books on the windowsill, the empty cupboards he had scented earlier. In this district, a human caught with a high-born shifter child would be lucky to get a trial. Most would just disappear into an interrogation cell. You have nothing. No money, no protection, no status. Yet you risked your life for a stranger in the snow. Liliana looked down at her hands, red and chapped from years of scrubbing tables and washing dishes in scalding water. He was alone, and he was cold. She looked up, her gaze steady, despite the fear fluttering like a trapped bird in her chest. "I don't care about your politics or your species laws, Evander. When a child is freezing in the snow, you don't check his pedigree. You pick him up." Evander stared at her for a long moment. He was used to sycophants, to courtiers who weighed every word for advantage, to enemies who smiled while holding daggers behind their backs. He had never encountered something as disarming as simple, unvarnished decency. It confused his wolf. It intrigued the man. "You have a reckless heart, Liliana," he murmured, the harshness in his face softening by a fraction. Reckless hearts usually stop beating very young in this city. "Better reckless than cold," she countered softly. A groan from the bed silenced them. Cassian shifted, his small face contorting in pain. The fever was spiking again. Evander's attention snapped to his son instantly, the king vanishing, replaced by the terrified father. He placed a large hand on Cassian's forehead, his jaw tightening. "He's burning too hot," Evander growled, panic edging into his voice, making the deep timber of it crack. "His body is fighting the wolf. The poison Cordelia used. It forces the shift before he is ready. It's tearing him apart from the inside." "What can we do?" Liliana scrambled up, her limbs stiff from the cold. "He needs to cool down, but he cannot freeze," Evander commanded, his composure fracturing. I need water. Cool, not cold. And towels. Liliana rushed to the sink, soaking her only clean towel. When she returned, Evander had stripped off his dress shirt, revealing a torso scarred by claws and marked with ancient runic tattoos that seemed to pulse in the dim light. He didn't seem to notice his own nudity, focused entirely on the boy. He pulled Cassian against his bare chest, skin to skin, sharing his own supernatural stability to regulate the boy's fluctuating temperature. "Wipe his face," Evander ordered. Liliana knelt beside them. As she dabbed the cool cloth over the boy's sweat-slicked brow, her hand brushed Evander's arm. His skin was hard as iron, searing to the touch. A spark, electric and jarring, jumped between them, shocking them both. Evander's eyes locked onto hers. For a second, the room felt airless, the storm outside forgotten. "He smells like you now," Evander whispered, his voice rough, nostrils flaring slightly. "Honey and rain. You are marking him." "I'm just helping him," she whispered back, her breath hitching at the intensity of his stare. "In my world," Evander said, his gaze dropping to her lips, then back to her eyes, dark and unreadable. "There is no difference." The storm howled like a wounded beast, battering the thin glass of the window, threatening to shatter the sanctuary. It was 3:00, the hour of the wolf, the time when spirits were said to be most restless, and the veil between life and death was thinnest. Cassian was not getting better. The boy was thrashing in Evander's arms, hallucinating, his small claws extended and retracted rhythmically, shredding the expensive fabric of Evander's trousers and drawing thin lines of blood on his father's chest. "The shadows!" Cassian screamed, his voice high and terrified. His eyes flew open, but they were entirely black now, the violet irises swallowed by the void of the forced shift. "They have teeth, father. Don't let them in. The lady with the bitter candy. She's laughing." "I am here, Cassian. I am here," Evander rumbled, rocking him. But the Alpha's voice, usually a command that could bring armies to their knees, sounded hollow against the fever. "Fight it, son. You are a Greymore. We do not break. We do not yield." "He can't hear you," Liliana said, her voice trembling. She was sitting on the floor, holding a bowl of fresh water, her heart breaking for them both. "He's too deep in the nightmare. You're trying to command him, but he's just a scared little boy." "Then what do I do?" Evander roared, the sound shaking the dust from the ceiling. He looked at her, wild-eyed, his hair disheveled. The facade of the untouchable king was gone, stripped away by helplessness. "I can fight armies, Liliana. I can crush rebellions with a word, but I cannot fight this poison inside his veins. I cannot kill a fever." Liliana set the bowl down. She moved on instinct, crawling onto the mattress. She reached out, not for the boy, but for the father. She placed her hands on Evander's rigid shoulders, feeling the tension vibrating through his muscles. "He doesn't need a king right now," she said firmly, forcing him to look at her. "He needs comfort. He needs something soft. Your world is all hard edges, Evander. Steel and stone and laws. Give him something soft." Evander froze at the use of his given name. He looked down at the boy, then at Liliana. "I don't know how. I was raised to be iron." "Sing to him," she suggested gently. "I do not sing." "Then hum. Talk to him about something other than duty. Tell him about, I don't know, the first time you saw the snow. Tell him about the world outside the palace walls." Evander flinched, a shadow passing over his face. His mother is dead, and she was not soft. She was a political match, cold as this winter. "Then tell him about the stars," Liliana whispered. She began to hum herself, a low, melodic tune her grandmother used to sing while mending socks by the fire. It was a simple folk song, woven with sorrow and hope, older than the city itself. Cassian's thrashing slowed. The sound of a human voice, calm and melodic, seemed to cut through the chaos in his mind like a beacon. Evander watched her, mesmerized. He watched the way the lamplight caught the stray curls escaping her messy bun. He watched the gentle rise and fall of her chest. Slowly, awkwardly, he began to rumble deep in his chest. A purring sound, a vibration that was the wolf's version of a lullaby. It harmonized with her humming, a deep bass to her soprano. "The stars!" Evander rasped, his voice dropping to a storytelling cadence he hadn't used in years. "The stars are the eyes of the ancestors, Cassian. They watch the forest. They guide the hunter home when the path is lost." He continued to speak, weaving a tapestry of words about the great hunt in the sky, while Liliana hummed the counter-melody. Slowly the blackness receded from Cassian's eyes, leaving them a hazy, exhausted violet. His breathing hitched, then settled into a deep, restorative rhythm. The fever broke, sweating out in a sudden rush that left the sheets damp. Evander slumped against the headboard, drained. He looked at Liliana, who was sitting close enough that their knees touched. "You saved him," he said, the wonder clear in his voice. "He was slipping away and you pulled him back." "We saved him," she corrected, yawning, exhaustion finally claiming her. She slumped sideways, her head landing on Evander's bare shoulder. She meant to move immediately, to apologize for the transgression, but she was so tired, and he was so incredibly warm. Evander didn't push her away. Instead, the Alpha King, who allowed no one to touch him without permission, shifted slightly to accommodate her weight. He rested his cheek against the top of her head, breathing in the scent of poverty and purity. "Sleep, Liliana," he commanded softly into the darkness. "I will keep the shadows away." The morning did not come gently. It arrived with the roar of engines and the blinding glare of high beams cutting through the frosted window like searchlights. Liliana woke with a start. She was curled up on the foot of the bed, wrapped in Evander's suit jacket, which smelled of cedar and power. The bed was empty. Panic spiked in her chest. Had they left? Had it all been a fever dream? Then she saw him. Evander was standing by the window, fully dressed again, though his shirt was wrinkled and he wore no tie. He was watching the street below, his posture rigid, his hands clasped behind his back. "They are here," he said, his voice void of the intimacy from the night before. Liliana scrambled up, smoothing her hair, feeling painfully self-conscious. "Who?" "My guard, and the extraction team." The sound of heavy boots on the stairs was different this time, disciplined, rhythmic, military. A sharp knock echoed, followed immediately by the door opening. A man stepped in. He was leaner than Evander, with silver blonde hair tied back in a severe knot and eyes like polished steel. He wore a tactical vest over a dark sweater, a handgun holstered at his hip. Adrian Whitford, the beta of the Greymore pack. Adrian swept the room with a professional, cold gaze. He assessed the threat level, clocked Liliana as a non-combatant, and then fell to one knee before Evander. "My king," Adrian said, his voice crisp. "We tracked the biosignal from your watch. The city has been locked down. Cordelia is in custody, though she denies everything." "She would," Evander said coldly. "Is the medical transport ready?" "Waiting downstairs, sir. Dr. Valehart is prepping the IVs in the mobile unit." Adrian stood up, his eyes flickering to the bed where Cassian was just waking up, looking pale but lucid. "The prince?" "He lives," Evander said, glancing at Liliana. "Thanks to unexpected intervention." Adrian turned his gaze to Liliana. It wasn't hostile, but it was dismissive. To him, she was just part of the scenery, a temporary convenience. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, creamy envelope stamped with the royal seal. He placed it on the wobbly kitchen table. "For your trouble, miss," Adrian said. "This should cover any damages and buy your silence. You will forget you saw them. You will forget this night. If you speak to the press, the consequences will be severe." Liliana stared at the envelope. It was thick with cash, more money than she would make in 5 years at the Rusty Spoon. It was freedom. It was heat. It was food that wasn't stale. It was an insult. "I didn't do it for money," she said, quietly, her voice trembling with indignation. "I did it because he is a child." "Take it," Adrian said, turning back to the king, indifferent to her pride. "Sir, we must move. The paparazzi are already circling the perimeter of the Low District. We cannot be seen exiting a tenement with the heir." Evander moved to the bed and scooped Cassian up. The boy clung to his father, but his eyes searched the room until they found Liliana. "Lily," Cassian croaked, reaching a small hand out toward her. Evander paused at the door. He looked at the envelope on the table, then at the woman standing in the center of her freezing, broken apartment. He saw the pride in her spine and the sadness in her eyes. He realized then that leaving her here wasn't just ungrateful, it was dangerous. Cordelia's spies were everywhere. If they found out a human had nursed the heir, she would be hunted down just to get to the king. And more than that, the wolf inside him, the one that had purred against her hair last night, was pacing, agitated at the thought of separation. It did not want to leave the scent of honey behind. "Adrian," Evander said. "Sir? Get her a coat." Adrian blinked, his composure faltering for the first time. "Sir? She is coming with us." Liliana's jaw dropped. "What? No, I can't. My job. My life. I can't just leave." "Your life here is over," Evander said, his tone brokering no argument. He walked over to her, shifting Cassian to one arm so he could grab her hand with his free one. His grip was warm, possessive, and terrifyingly strong. "You touched the Crown Prince while he was in a vulnerable state. You are now a witness, a suspect, and a savior. You are unsafe here, Liliana. Cordelia will burn this building down to silence you." "I can take care of myself," she protested, trying to pull her hand away, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Against Frost?" "Yes," Evander said, pulling her closer until she was flush against his chest, forcing her to look up at him. "Against wolves?" "No." He leaned down, his voice dropping to a whisper that sent shivers down her spine, warmer than the tea, sharper than the cold. "Besides," he murmured, his gold eyes burning into hers, claiming her before she even realized she was lost, "Cassian needs you, and I am not done with you." He turned to his stunned Beta. "Bring her things. We leave now." Evander swept her out of the apartment, down the stairs, and into the blinding white morning. Liliana didn't look back at the envelope on the table. She was too busy trying to keep her footing as she was dragged from the shadows of the alley into the dangerous, glittering light of the king's world. The Greymore estate was not merely a home, it was a fortress dressed in the deception of velvet and mahogany. Situated high on the cliffs overlooking Oakhaven, it seemed to float above the clouds, a world entirely separate from the grime and slush of the Low District Liliana had left behind only hours ago. She stood in the center of a guest suite that was larger than the entire building she had lived in for the last 5 years. The scale of it was oppressive. The ceilings were lost in shadow, painted with frescoes of great hunts from centuries past. The floors were marble, veined with gold and heated from beneath. warming her feet through her worn socks. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of a sprawling, snow-covered forest, Evander's territory, stretching as far as the eye could see. Liliana wrapped her arms around herself, feeling acutely like an intruder. Her reflection in the darkened glass was a stark contrast to the opulence around her. Fraying jeans, a sweater that had seen better decades, and hair that was frizzy from the storm. She was a smudge of coal on a pristine canvas. "You look like a deer waiting for the arrow," a voice said, cutting through the silence. Liliana turned, her heart jumping. A woman stood in the doorway, dressed in a pristine white lab coat that seemed almost too bright for the dim room. She had silver hair cut in a sharp, severe bob and eyes that were intelligent, assessing, and surprisingly kind. "I am Dr. Helena Veilhart," the woman said, stepping inside. Her movement was silent, predatory grace masked by professional courtesy. "I'm here to check on you," the king insisted. He feared the shock of the transition might be overwhelming. "I'm not the patient," Liliana said, her voice sounding small in the vast room. "Cassian is. How is he?" "Cassian is sleeping. His fever has broken completely, though his body is exhausted." Helena smiled, a genuine expression that eased some of the tension in Liliana's shoulders. "You did something extraordinary, Miss Ashford. That poison. It was a concentrated extract of silver dust and nightshade, designed to accelerate the metabolic shift until the heart simply gives out. It is usually fatal within an hour." Helena moved closer, her gaze intense. "Your warmth, or your refusal to let him succumb to the cold, it slowed his heart rate just enough. You bought his system the time it needed to recognize the toxin and fight back. You didn't just keep him warm, you anchored him." "Is he going to be okay?" Liliana asked, desperate for certainty. "Physically? Yes. He is young and strong." Helena's face darkened, the professional mask slipping to reveal worry. "But politically? That is a different sickness entirely. The wolves are gathering downstairs in the Great Hall. Cordelia Moorcrest has arrived with her entourage. She is demanding an audience with the Council of Elders. She claims you kidnapped the prince and that she merely tried to rescue him from your clutches." Liliana's blood ran cold. "That's a lie. She left him to die in the snow." "Truth is a fragile thing in this house," Helena warned, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Evander is powerful, the most powerful alpha we have seen in generations, but he is bound by the old laws. He cannot simply execute a high-born noble without irrefutable proof. And right now, the only witness is a delirious child and a human woman with no standing, no lineage, and no pack." The heavy oak door opened again, and this time the air in the room didn't just shift. It pressurized. Evander entered. He had shed the travel-worn clothes of the blizzard. Now he wore the formal regalia of the Alpha King, a charcoal suit cut to perfection, a shirt of crisp white silk, and the silver crest of the wolf pinned to his lapel. He looked every inch the monarch, terrifying, remote, and lethally beautiful. But when his eyes landed on Liliana, the gold in his irises softened, the predator recognizing its mate. "Helena, give us a moment." The doctor bowed deeply and left, closing the heavy door with a soft, final click. Evander crossed the room in 3 long strides, eating up the distance between them. He didn't ask if she was okay. He inspected her. His gaze swept over her face, checking for fear, for injury. He reached out, his large hand hovering near her cheek, feeling the heat radiating from her skin, before he pulled back, remembering the invisible walls between them. "They are waiting for me," he said, his voice tight with suppressed rage. The council. They want to know why a human is in the royal wing. They can smell you on me. Tell them I'm leaving, Liliana whispered, though the thought made her chest ache with a sudden, sharp hollow. Tell them I was just a Samaritan. I don't want to cause a war, Evander. I don't want to be the reason you lose your crown. You are not causing a war, Liliana. You are the reason I still have a son. Evander stepped closer, invading her personal space, his scent of rain and ozone enveloping her. I am going down there to end this, to burn the rot out of my court. But I need to know one thing before I walk into that pit of vipers. He looked down at her, his expression unguarded and vulnerable for the first time since she had met him in her tiny apartment. Do you trust me? Liliana looked up into the eyes of a predator who had carried her coat, who had hummed to his dying son, who had dragged her out of poverty not because he had to, but because he couldn't bear to leave her behind. Yes, she breathed, the word terrifyingly true. Good. Evander's jaw set, the king returning to the surface. Then stay here. No matter what you hear, no matter the screaming or the howling, do not open this door until I come for you. The council chamber was a cavernous hall of ancient stone and shadow, located in the bowels of the estate. It was lit by iron chandeliers holding real fire, the flames casting dancing, monstrous shapes against the tapestries that depicted the history of the Greymore line. 12 elders sat in a semicircle on a raised dais, their faces grim, their eyes ancient and unyielding. These were the keepers of the old laws, the wolves who remembered when humanity was nothing more than prey. In the center of the stone floor stood Cordelia Moorcrest. She was beautiful in a sharp, crystalline way, dressed in ice-blue silk that shimmered like a frozen lake. Her blonde hair was coiffed to perfection, and she stood with her chin high, radiating outraged innocence. But beneath the perfume, the room smelled of her anxiety, acrid and sour. I demand justice, Cordelia's voice rang out, clear and piercing, bouncing off the stone walls. I found the boy wandering the streets of the Low District. I tried to help him, to bring him home, and that human snatched him away. She dragged him into the filth of her hovel. She probably intended to ransom him to our enemies. A murmur of agreement rippled through the elders. Heads nodded. Humans were viewed with suspicion at best, disdain at worst. The narrative fit their prejudices perfectly. And where was the king? Cordelia pressed, sensing her advantage. While his son was being abducted, he was nowhere to be found. Is this the protection the Greymore line promises us? The heavy double doors at the back of the chamber boomed open, slamming against the stone walls with a violence that silenced the room instantly. Evander walked in. He didn't walk, he stalked. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy, the Alpha's dominance rolling off him in waves that made the elders shift uncomfortably in their seats. He stopped in the center of the floor, ignoring Cordelia entirely, turning his back to her to face the council. You speak of justice, Evander said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated the stained glass windows high above. Let us speak of truth. Evander, Cordelia poured, stepping toward him, attempting to reclaim the narrative. She reached for his arm, a false intimacy. I am so relieved you found him. I was frantic with worry when I lost sight of him in the storm. Evander turned to her slowly. The movement was so fluid, so controlled, it was more terrifying than a snarl. Were you? He asked softly. Strange. Because my son, in his delirium, did not call for his frantic aunt. He called for the shadows to stop biting. He screamed that you gave him the bitter candy. He was sick, my king, confused by the cold. He was poisoned, Evander stated. The word hung in the air like a guillotine blade. "A tragedy," Cordelia said smoothly, though a bead of sweat tracked down her temple. "Perhaps something he ate in that human's kitchen. You know how filthy their food is." "Doctor, Valihart found traces of nightshade and silver dust in his blood," Evander continued, stepping closer to Cordelia. She held her ground, but her heartbeat was audible to everyone in the room, a frantic, fluttering bird. "A specific blend, rare, expensive. It requires alchemy only practiced in the High District. A human waitress would not know it exists, let alone how to acquire it." Evander reached into his pocket and pulled out a small glass vial. The liquid inside was a vibrant, toxic purple. "We raided your townhouse an hour ago, Cordelia. We found the rest of the batch hidden in the false bottom of your vanity." The council gasped. The elders leaned forward, their eyes narrowing. The evidence was physical, undeniable. Cordelia's face went pale, her composure cracking like thin ice under a hammer. You planted that," she screeched, pointing a trembling finger at him, her mask of civility disintegrating. "You would frame me to protect your human pet. It's disgraceful. An alpha king bringing a stray into the royal wing? Mating with a waitress? It weakens the bloodline. It insults us all." The room went dead silent. Cordelia had said the quiet part out loud. She had played her final card, prejudice. She was betting that the council's hatred of humans would outweigh their loyalty to the king. Evander didn't roar. He didn't strike her. He smiled. It was a terrifying, wolfish smile that showed too many teeth. "Mating?" he asked softly, the word echoing dangerously. "I said nothing of mating. But thank you, Cordelia, for confirming your motive. You didn't just want the throne. You wanted to ensure no half-blood heir, or any heir that wasn't of your choosing, could ever sit on it." He turned back to the council, his expression stony. "She attacked the heir. She violated the sacred pact of kin. She sought to murder a child to advance her station. The punishment is not debate." The head elder stood up. He was old, his fur grey, his eyes milky with cataracts, but his voice was iron. "The law is clear. For treason against the blood. Exile," the head elder pronounced. "Stripped of rank, stripped of name, stripped of territory." "No!" Cordelia screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. Exile was worse than death for a wolf. It was to be a ghost, hunted and alone. She lunged toward Evander, her hands forming into claws, her eyes shifting into the black of a forced shift. "I did it for the pack! I did it for—" Evander caught her wrist in mid-air. He didn't even look at her. He just squeezed. The sound of bone crunching echoed through the hall. Cordelia fell to her knees, sobbing, cradling her shattered arm. "You did it for yourself," Evander said, releasing her as the guards moved in to drag her away. "And you forgot the first rule of the wolf. The pack protects its own." "You are no longer pack." As the doors slammed shut on Cordelia's screams, Evander looked up toward the ceiling, his gaze piercing through the stone and timber toward the guest suite where a waitress waited. The politics were handled. The rot was cut out. Now came the hardest part, convincing a bird that it was safe to nest in a wolf's den. Liliana was pacing a trench into the expensive carpet. Every sound from the hallway made her jump. She had packed her few belongings back into her pockets, a futile gesture, as she had nothing. When the door finally opened, it wasn't Evander. It was a small, pajama-clad missile. "Lily!" Cassian ran into the room, barefoot and looking tired, but his cheeks were pink with life. Liliana dropped to her knees and caught him, the impact knocking the wind out of her. She buried her face in his neck, breathing in the scent of soap and healing herbs. "You're okay?" she cried, tears finally spilling over, hot and fast. "You're okay?" "Father said you saved me," Cassian said, pulling back to look at her with solemn violet eyes that were far too old for his face. "He said you fought the winter for me. He said you gave me your heat. I just held on," she sniffled, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. "I wasn't going to let you go." "I heard you singing," Cassian whispered. "About the stars. It made the dark go away." Evander stood in the doorway watching them. The tension of the trial had vanished from his shoulders, replaced by a deep, weary stillness. He looked tired, but at peace. "Cassian," Evander said gently, "go with Helena. She has hot cocoa waiting, and she promised to read you the story about the moon rabbit." The boy hesitated. He looked at Liliana, grabbing her hand tight. Then he looked at his father. "Don't let her go, father," he whispered, loud enough for both of them to hear. "She smells like home." Cassian released her hand and ran out to the waiting doctor. Liliana stood up slowly. The room felt suddenly very large and very quiet without the child's energy. "Cordelia?" she asked. "Gone," Evander said simply. "She will never hurt him again. The pack has rejected her." "So, it's over." Liliana smoothed her skirt, her hands trembling. She felt the inevitable goodbye hanging in the air like a guillotine. "I suppose I should go. I need to find a new job. Mr. Higgins probably fired me for missing my shift, and I need to pay the rent before—" "You are not going back to the Rusty Spoon," Evander said, his voice low, interrupting her spiral. He began to walk toward her. "Evander, I can't stay here," Liliana argued, backing up until her legs hit the velvet sofa. Panic rose in her throat. "I saw the way your guards looked at me. I heard what you said about the laws. I'm a human. I don't belong in a palace. I don't know which fork to use. I don't know how to curtsy. I am just a waitress." "You're right," Evander said, stopping inches from her. "This place is cold. It is full of politics, ancient grudges, and old ghosts. It is no place for a reckless heart like yours." He reached out and took her hand. His skin was rough, hot and electric. His thumb traced the rough skin of her knuckles, a reverence in his touch that made her breath catch in her throat. "But a king doesn't rule by laws alone. He rules by instinct. And my instinct tells me that if you leave, the winter will come back into this house and never leave. It will freeze us from the inside out." "I'm nobody," she whispered, her resistance crumbling under the golden intensity of his gaze. "You are the woman who faced down an alpha with a frying pan to protect a child not her own," Evander corrected, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "You are the woman who hummed to the monsters to keep them away. You are the only person in this entire kingdom who looked at my son and saw a boy, not a crown. You are not nobody, Liliana. To us, you are everything." He lifted her hand to his lips, kissing the center of her palm. The sensation sent a shock wave through her body that curled her toes and set her heart racing. "I cannot offer you a simple life. My world is dangerous. It is loud. It is often cruel." He looked into her eyes, stripping away all his defenses, offering her the truth of his soul. "But it is lonely without you. Stay. Not as a guest, not as a nursemaid. Stay as whatever we become." Liliana looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the scars that marred his perfection, the burden of command that weighed on his brow, and the deep, terrifying hope in his eyes. She realized that she had found another stray in the snow, one much bigger and more dangerous, but just as in need of warmth. "I don't have a dress for dinner," she said, a tear sliding down her cheek, a surrender. Evander smiled, and this time it reached his eyes, bright and blinding as the sunrise over the snow. "We'll buy you 1,000 dresses," he promised, pulling her into his arms. She melted against him, fitting into the space against his chest as if she had been carved for it. "Or none at all, as long as you are here." He kissed her forehead, sealing a pact stronger than any law. Outside the great windows, the heavy grey clouds finally broke. For the first time in weeks, a shaft of pure, golden sunlight pierced the storm, touching the white earth and promising a thaw. In the end, it wasn't the ancient laws or the strength of claws that saved the Greymoor line. It was a cup of tea, a hummed lullaby, and the courage of a woman who had nothing but gave everything. Liliana didn't just save a boy that night. She healed a king. The crown is heavy, but it is lighter when carried by two. Karma had come for Cordelia in the form of her own ambition, but destiny had come for Liliana in the form of love. It reminds us that sometimes the most powerful magic isn't in the blood, it's in the heart. If this story warmed your heart like a fire on a winter night, please like, share, and subscribe for more tales of love, destiny, and magic.